I believe it's recording. Here we go. Brilliant. So obviously today is World Wildlife Day, and it's great to be celebrating it with you. Today the theme, well, this year's theme is about recovering key species for ecosystem restoration, and particularly drawing attention to the conservation status of some endangered species, and looking at how we can find solutions to conserving them. So these themes will be picked up by Peter during his talk. So to introduce Peter, Peter is our CEO, and he grew up on a dairy farm on the outskirts of Welsh Pool, which is on the banks of the River Severn, and that's where his love for nature first began. He completed a bachelor's degree at the University at Cardiff and also a master's in advanced wildlife conservation at the University of the West of England. And before joining us here at the Welsh Dee Trust, he also worked for the Seven Rivers Trust and also the Wye and Usk Foundation. So that's a little bit of background tonight on your speaker, Peter. So I'll hand over to him now to deliver the presentation.
Thanks, Maddie. Welcome all. It's good to see a lot of people, a lot of interest, which is quite exciting. Maddie sort of stole my thunder a little bit because I was going to introduce myself and say all of those things that Maddie has just sort of said about myself. So yeah, I'll jump straight into it from there. Some of you might be very aware of Welsh Dee Trust. Some of you probably a lot less aware of who we are, but we are a small but growing charity, an environmental charity that's based in Llangollen, on the banks of the Dee, pretty much. And our aim as a charity really is to improve the health of the River Dee for both wildlife and people. And when I say the River Dee, what do I mean really? I mean, you know, the full River Dee, including its estuary, all of the tributaries, everything from the source and everything that flows downstream goes over Chester Weir and makes its way into the estuary. So the River Dee is quite an iconic and quite a special river. I mean, I would say that as the CEO of Welsh Dee Trust, but it really is quite unique in Europe and in the world because of that. It really, I think one of the things that sets it out is the huge changes in the sort of morphology and the hydrology of the river. It starts up in Snowdonia with quite steep, fast-flowing streams such as this one. You know, it flows down and on through to Llangollen, where it becomes a bedrock, fast-flowing, highly flooding type of river before actually reaches the Cheshire Plains. And on the Cheshire Plains, it becomes more of a slow-flowing, low, low river, if that makes sense. So not a mountainous river, but a low country river, I guess is the term I'm looking for, low country. And it's really because of this huge variety of morphology and the differences in the mountains and the landscape that the river flows through. It also has a huge variety of different species, of different habitats, and because of this, it really has become quite unique and is quite iconic and really quite important. Huge variety of species. It has a lot of the various river species that we all know and love, such as Atlantic salmon, eels, sea lampreys, brook lampreys, river lampreys, huge varieties of fish, huge varieties of birds, otters, water voles, mammals, huge variety of river plants that really, you know, I think makes it really quite a special river. And this is really shown out in the sort of the high levels of protection and environmental protection that the river has. Llyn-Tegid, which is towards the top end of the river, is a Ramsar site. The river itself is a triple SI and a special area of conservation, and then the estuary on its own is also a special area of conservation. So really, this river has some of the highest levels of protection that you can get for habitat for an environment in Europe. And you know, that's part of what we're trying to do, protect it. Unfortunately, these levels of protection are not really working for the species that are found within the rivers. Many of the populations, many of the sort of iconic species of the river are actually declining quite heavily. You know, there's many of them are critically endangered. Many of them are not reaching the favourable status that's required to make the special area of conservation favourable. And really, if you, I mean, I pulled all these photos together at random, and it was only after I was adding these titles that I realised quite how many of the sort of important species that are associated with the Dee are really endangered. The only one that's not truly listed by a government as endangered is on that list on those photos is the brown trout. And even the brown trout is dropping in population. I'm sure there's probably fishermen on this call that will tell you that there's not as many brown trout in the river or the River Dee as there used to be. So, you know, the river and its wildlife and the species within it are really in quite a severe place. To focus in on two of the sort of really unique and iconic species of the Dee. The first is a fish called the gwynniads. So this is really an endemic type of whitefish, a freshwater whitefish that is found only in Llyn. It's very closely related to other types of whitefish, but it is, you know, a unique species, and IUCN call it a unique species, and it's only found in the one lake in the world, which is in the top end at Bala Lake at Llyn. Unfortunately, this fish is also critically endangered. It's threatened by sort of poor water quality within the lake, and also by introduced fish, particularly the waf, which was introduced in sort of the 70s and 80s, and is thought to be quite a heavy predator of the gwynniad fish. The other really quite unique species for the river is the what's called the scarce yellow mayfly. This is a species of stonefly, which is found in the Dee in around the sort of Bangor Dee area. It was first discovered in 1953. And it's found then at 9 different sites across the Dee, spread out across sort of 45 kilometres. And it was found again at these sites in 1981 and in 1982. By 93, it sort of reduced down to just being found at 5 of those sites, and then in 1995 they could only find it at 1 of those sites where it was originally found in 53. Again, continuous surveys then in 97, 98, 99, 2003, 2004, 2007, 2012, and 2015 failed to find any of these species, any of these scarce yellow mayfly, and it was really thought that it'd probably become extinct in the River Dee then, and therefore extinct within the UK. However, it has luckily been refound in 2017 and in 2018, and so it's really now at these 2 sites where it's found in 2017-18. It's probably the only place in Western Europe that this species of stonefly is actually still found. And hopefully there's going to be some more surveys in 2022. We've already tried to do some earlier this year, but floods and high water sort of got in the way. But, you know, I guess what I'm really trying to say is that the River Dee isn't just your average river. It is incredibly important, not just for the variety of river species that you find across the UK, but also for these very unique and unfortunately critically endangered species, which are found only in the Dee. So, what are our plans really, and what do we do at Welsh Dee Trust to try and turn around all of these critically endangered and suffering species? So, I took over as I joined Welsh Dee Trust, at the sort of end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and we at that time went through a sort of strategy plan of what is it Welsh Dee Trust can do to really try and turn around all of these declining populations of all these species. So what we chose to do, as I said, we're quite a small charity. So we really wanted to focus in on things where we knew we could have an impact. And really, we're taking this approach that if we focus on the things where we know we can have an impact, we make small changes and we make small and we work to make small changes. If we do that again and again and again and repeat it and sort of do that long legwork of making those small changes step by step, we can start to really turn around the fortunes of the river. So we, deciding on what we wanted to focus on, we chose 5 sort of key programs that we thought these are the things that Welsh Dee Trust, as a small charity, we can really have an impact on. These are sort of 5 programs: habitat, farming, and I'll go into them in a bit more detail. So the first one was restoring river habitat. This is absolutely key to protecting and defending most species. We really focused on restoring the habitat at Welsh Dee Trust, with the hope that the species can then benefit from the restored habitat and those populations can turn around. What does it mean, restoring with habitat? Well, really there's 2 main focuses of our work. One is sort of restoring the natural processes of a river and of the tributaries and streams of the river. Oh, sorry, I've gone a bit wild there for a second. Just because, you know, rivers are incredibly diverse and all constantly changing environments. You know, a river never stays the same. It's eroding, there's trees falling in, you get deposition, and it's that constant changing environment that creates so many of the niches that are required for wildlife. Humans, us as a species, we have sort of don't like change. Potentially, we like to keep our environment tidier and we like to keep it the same. And so this is a lot of what we've done to rivers. We've stopped rivers eroding, we've stopped them moving, we've built walls and flood banks, and where rivers have eroded, we like to put the river in its place and keep it there, has been our approach. So really, our approach at Welsh Dee Trust is trying to restore a lot of those lost processes that we've had before. What does that look like? So this is a pretty standard picture of this is the River Dee, which flows into the Dee up by Llandrillo. This is pretty standard of what many of our sort of upstream rivers look like. It probably looks quite healthy, quite nice to most people, to a lot of people, and it does, does to me as well, I guess. But there is a lot of processes that are lost from this. There's no all of the trees are the same age. There's no young trees on this bit of the river, and because there's no young trees, there's no replacing trees. So if all these trees, when these trees get very old and die and fall over, they there's nothing young coming through to replace them. And so in most severe cases, you can actually end up with no trees at all on the riverbank. The actual stream itself has been pushed into this shape, so there's very little sort of erosion going on the banks or deposition. So there's no gravel bars or there's no gravel bars, there's no pools within the river, there's no deep sections and no shallow sections, and this sort of means you lose a lot of the niches within the habitat. The grass as well on the side of the river is all the same height. It's been grazed that way, and it's really, I guess you've lost a lot of the diversity in and around the river, and because you lose the diversity of the niches and the habitat, you then lose a lot of the diversity in the species. So what do we do when we're looking at a section like this? We undertake projects like this. So in this photo, we've actually put these large boulders back in, which has caught that bit of wood. We haven't put that bit of wood there, but that's caught that bit of piece of tree. And this kickstarts a lot of the processes that I was talking about. So Now, when there's high water, and this photo was taken very early after the boulders put in, it actually looks very different already. You get pools created around the rocks. You get big lines of gravel deposited behind the back of the rocks, which creates new gravel bars, and it's really kick-starting that sort of process of the water in the river making a lot of those changes. The other thing we do, and we do an awful lot of this, is fencing out livestock from the river. This gives trees and the grasses and the wildflowers chances to grow and kickstart that regeneration of trees and plants alongside the river, which is so important for sort of creating the variety of niches again. The other main challenge, which we try and focus on, is barriers. So fish, particularly, as well as some invertebrates, but particularly fish, are very migratory species. Obviously, quite famously, the salmon is a migration species that goes from river out to sea and up to Iceland and comes back again. European eels, which do the same thing and go out to sea and come back. But even brown trout, which are found in one location in the river, they are migratory species and they move up and down the river to complete a big part of their life cycle. One of the main problems we've got on the River Dee and all rivers in the UK and in the world actually is man-made structures on the river which block those migration channels. So in this photo you can see this is in a bit of forestry. It's a Irish drain bridge, so the water goes underneath and over the top, and you can see those sort of concrete sleepers there, which are put there to hold up the road so that the road doesn't wash away. But if you imagine a fish swimming upstream and getting to that, it's very shallow water. They can't jump up and over that. Even salmon were not getting over this feature because either the water was too high and the salmon couldn't get to the bottom, or when the water was low enough that salmon could feel comfortable to jump, it was too shallow for them to actually get a good run up to make it up and over what is a very sharp edge there for them to jump over. So a lot of our work is focused on these barriers to fish migration, quite large projects. So for this one, we built what we call a rocky ramp or rock ramp, which basically involves putting boulders in behind the bridge to create what is a step ladder, essentially, or a ramp, so that you're taking away that edge, that hard edge and that hard jump, and you're creating, a path for fish to migrate upstream and downstream on sites like this. In an ideal world, we would just remove the barrier completely if it's a redundant feature, and many of these are redundant features. Weirs built for mills back in the 60s, and they've all been abandoned, but the weir is still there. So ideally we'd completely remove it because that's a long-term solution forever. But where we can't remove it, we build additional structures around it to make sure it's not blocking fish migration. It's a big key part of our work. The second program that we focus on is very much focused on agriculture. Agriculture is by far the largest land use within the Dee catchment. It's a big part of the local. It's a big part of the local economy. It's a big part of the local community and community feeling within the Dee, and it's a big part of producing a lot of the food that we eat. Unfortunately, it is quite a serious source of pollution into the Dee. Roughly a third of the water bodies that we find in the Dee that are monitored, well, they're all monitored, but roughly a third of them are failing, primarily because of agricultural diffuse pollution. It's a very, very difficult problem to fix. It's not one pipe with very obviously dirty, polluted water coming out of it, like you might get at a factory or a sewer treatment work. It's many, many small sources of pollution, and each of those small sources of pollution is putting in a little bit of nitrates or phosphates or sediment, which is called, or pesticides, which is causing a problem. But because they build up over many farms, you actually get quite a large impact downstream, on the Dee. So really, we have a farm officer who works full time for us at the trust, and she focuses primarily on two major pollutants, which are the ones we think we can have a biggest impact on. These are nutrients, so nitrates and phosphates, which are really quite damaging to the plant life of the river, but also the invertebrate life of the river, and they really impact the food chain at the very bottom. And then also sediments, which are quite bad for turbidity and the colour of the water, but also really have a really serious impact on fish eggs and the things that live not in the water, but living in and amongst the gravel. So a lot of the invertebrates are killed off when the sediment actually smothers the bottom of the riverbed and smothers all of those species and fish eggs out. So what do we do? So we provide completely free and completely confidential advice. As I said, we're a charity. We don't have any sort of regulatory ability. We can't take it to the court. We can't do anything like that. That's the role of NRW and the Environment Agency as the regulators. So what we try to do very much is be the sort of the friendly face, I guess, and be the helping hand to help farmers tackle these problems. So we do this by providing advice, contributions, and quite importantly, we provide our time as well, because farmers tend to be very busy people, and just time to go and get quotes and do the paperwork and help with the paperwork and help manage contractors to complete jobs is really a big part of what we do. What does that look like in practice? So we do, basically we approach it in two ways. We do what we call a farmyard technical assessment and a soil health assessment. The farmyard technical assessment is quite simple, really. We go and visit a farm. We walk around the farm of the farmer, and we identify the places that the pollution is leaving the farmyard and leaving the farm due to infrastructure. We find it. We work with the farmer to come up with solutions. We then help with some money towards it, normally sort of 50% cost, and we help get the contractors, get the quotes in to come and fix it. This is a sort of quite a clear example. On the other side of that green shed, or that green gate, that is where the cattle are standing before they come into the parlour. This is a dairy farm. The huge what was I going to say? So the vast majority of the slurry from that area and from the washing of the parlour is going backwards into the slurry lagoon. But you can see, it's pretty obvious, really. There's a certain amount which is coming underneath the gate, flowing round and going into that drain. And that drain is actually a clean water drain that's going straight to a pond, and the pond is then overflowing into a stream into the River Dee, which eventually flows into the River Dee. So this is a pretty clear cut, pretty simple source of pollution pathway. It's making its way into watercourse. So we helped, pretty simple solution, but we helped the farmer get some contractors in to come and fix it. We helped pay part of the contribution towards getting it fixed, and we put in like a sleeping policeman, raised up the area underneath that gate by a couple of foot, so that all of that slurry, rather than coming this way towards us, towards the person who took the photo and into the drain, actually flowed backwards, and it's all then collected in the slurry lagoon. Quite simple, really. Fix the problem. It might seem like it's not going to have a huge impact on water quality, but on the whole Dee, when you think about how big the Dee is and the many millions of cubic meters of water that are flowing down the Dee every day. But this is really our approach, and by fixing each of these problems and fixing them repeatedly again and again and again and again across all these farms, we really hope that we can start to turn the tide on agricultural pollution and really start to reduce its impact. it'll take a while, you know, there's no doubt about it. But I know we are having an impact, and we will continue to have an impact. The other aspect of our work with farms is very much focused on soil health. Rivers and soil health and the health of rivers is very connected to how healthy the soils are. And by how healthy the soils, I mean how much organic matter it's got in. You know, any gardeners amongst you will know, you know, the difference between a clay and a subsoil and a healthy compost is huge. The amount of water it can soak up, the amount of nutrients it can hold onto during heavy rainstorms is very different. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the soils within the Dee catchment aren't as healthy as they could be. They've got, you know, low organic matters. They've been quite heavily compacted, which is due to sort of farming practices of the past, really. So we visit farms. We go to sort of 3 or 4 different fields. We do what we call a soil health assessment. We do various tests, such as an earthworm count. We do an assessment. We do bulk density test. We pull that together to identify if there's any problems with the soil on the farm. If there is, we then offer grant funding towards fixing some of these problems, and that can be something like this. This is called a sward lifter. This is a piece of machinery that really is for breaking up compaction in the soil. So if the soil is compacted and can't soak up as much water, this breaks up that compaction and allows water to infiltrate into the soil rather than washing off the surface. Because if it washes straight off the surface, you get much faster runoff, you get much bigger floods downstream, plus it tends to carry whatever is on the field with it. So that carries the pesticides, the nutrients, the soils, the cow muck that was sat on top of that field, that gets washed off into the river rather than getting pulled down and soaked down into the field. So it's really, really key. So this is something we help farmers with, and we grant funds to do this. This is very much a sort of short-term fix. It makes an instant impact, but what you really need to get long-term change is changes in practice. So we offer two main ways that we're trying to push this. We are promoting herbal lays, and we help farms implement a herbal lay. This is really changing the species that are grown within a field, particularly grassland fields. Well, only grassland fields. So rather than having sort of one species of grass, we're trying to push to have at least 10, 11 different species of grass and wildflowers. This creates a huge diversity in the roots that are then in the field, and then the roots that are in the soil, and this makes a real difference to how the soil sort of comes alive. You get a lot more worms, you get a lot more other invertebrates, you get a lot more fungi, and then this sort of increases the organic matter level, helps break down compaction, and you get a much healthier soil that can hold a lot more water and hold a lot more nutrients. So really, what we're trying to do, this is the sort of soils that we're finding quite regularly. This is quite heavily compacted soil. You can see not a huge amount of air pockets within it, not a huge amount of roots, very few earthworms, and we're trying to move it more to this sort of soil. These two soils are actually, this is taken in the same field, meters apart from each other. One where the farming was more intensive, and this one is taken on the field boundary on the edge where it's not as intensive. So what we're trying to do is move the middle of the field, which currently looks like this, to look more like this and be a lot more open, a lot more higher organic matter levels, and hold on to a lot more water. Again, slightly slow process, but 2021 we sort of worked on 350 acres of soil and fields, and trying to improve 350 acres. Target is to double that into 2022, and it's a bit of it builds. Every year you add 350 acres, very quickly you get to quite a large amount of soils which are being improved in the Dee, and it's hopefully this is starting to turn that sort of long-term decline back into a long-term improvement, really. Of course, agricultural pollution isn't really the only source of pollution. There is many others. I'm sure those of you who are interested in rivers will have come across the huge problems with sewage and combined sewage overflows and the less than ideal practices that some of the water companies have been up to with some of their sewage treatment works. And there's a lot of work to be done there. But also there's septic tanks, there's household misconnections where, what should be going from a house into the sewer is actually going down clean water drains outside the house. We have huge problems with road drains where a lot of the tyre runoff, the heavy metals that come from cars builds up on the roads, and then during thunderstorm, all of that is washed off the road and into the river. We have problems with plastic and plastic pollution, both from litter but also from microplastics, and that's a growing and more concerning problem as more and more research comes out about how impactful that plastic actually is on watercourses and the wildlife that lives within rivers. And also, unfortunately, there is still factories and there is still industry which is doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and that is causing a cause of water pollution. I think we're very aware at Welsh Dee Trust that across the Dee, there's 5 of us now at Welsh Dee Trust, and we work very hard, but it's a big area, and so really we know we can't identify all of these and fix all of these problems ourselves. But what we really want to do is increase knowledge and support local communities to help them identify and create solutions and implement them to tackle all of these smaller and different types of pollution themselves. To do this, we're starting to supply groups with training, with equipment for monitoring of water quality. A lot of our focus is on the invertebrates, and so we're setting up or have set up or in the process of setting up what we call the Dee Riverfly Hub. So this is training volunteers to be able to go out and look at the invertebrates in their local patch of river, identify if those invertebrates are a signal that there's pollution there or not. By looking at the invertebrates, you can see what invertebrates are missing, and if there are invertebrates missing, then you know that there's some pollution going on. And you can also sort of monitor the long-term health of the river by constantly looking at these invertebrates. So we're helping to train a lot of volunteers to do that. So currently we've set up 7 monitoring sites on the River Allen. Hopefully this year we're going to set up monitoring sites working with volunteers on the Alford Brook and the Ceiriog. And again, this will grow and grow until we have hopefully a whole army of people out there monitoring water quality. Monitoring water quality is all good, but actually when you find a problem, it needs fixing. Finding the problem is step 1. Fixing it is step 2. And we are going to support local communities to tackle and fix a lot of these problems. That could be through changing drainage and putting what's called sort of sustainable drainage. So this is ponds and wetlands that capture the water from clean water drains, and before that water goes straight into the river, it goes through a wetland, which gives it a chance for all of the pollutants to settle out, and then the water that leaves the wetland is clean. So helping to put a lot of those in. We're going to be helping to organise more litter picks for local community groups, as well as arranging our own litter picks. And I think we have one on Saturday in Chester. And yeah, really start to build this. This is really a big growth path of what we want to do at Welsh Dee Trust. Maddie, who started with us towards the end of January, is our community support officer and our project officer on this program. And so this is a new area of work for us, really. But yeah, I think it's really important, and I think by building those sort of strong community groups and strong community knowledge, I think that's how we can have a real impact on improving the river. because Welsh Dee Trust, we can do a lot, but we can do a lot more with volunteers and support and supporting other people. So the fourth program, which is called the Catchment-Based approach, is probably our least interesting program, if I'm brutally honest. But the Dee is, there's a lot going on in the Dee. It flows through two different countries. It flows from Wales into England. There's a lot of water. There's 3 different water companies that work on the Dee. There's an AOMB that works on the Dee. There's organisations working around the Dee. There's companies working around the Dee estuary. There's 2 different wildlife trusts. All of those different people and different organisations mean that a lot of work is going on, but sometimes maybe not as targeted or working together as could be hoped, particularly when it comes to working in England and Wales and the 2 different governments. So really our catchment-based approach is all about bringing together all of those different organisations so that we can work better in partnership, so that we can get best value for money with the projects we're doing, and really, make the impacts that we want to do. This does mean that we work with water companies, with governments. It's challenging sometimes, as anyone that's ever worked with any government agency might know. It can be quite difficult, and it also means we potentially work with companies and businesses where we don't agree with their approach, we don't agree with things that they've done, but this is, I think, an important part of our work. And I really believe that by bringing people together and working in partnership, we can get better outcomes for the river. And so then the final sort of program of our work is very much focused on the flows and the amount of water that goes down the river. The River Dee is in fact the most heavily regulated river within Europe. This is largely because it provides the drinking water for about 2 million homes within the northeast. Because of this, really, the level that the Dee is at is decided upon by a group called the Dee Consultative Committee, and they monitor it, and every 15 minutes they adapt the river level of the Dee. Obviously, when there's flooding, there's not a lot. When it rains, when you have a thunderstorm and it rains a lot, there's only so much you can do. But particularly at low flows, when the river's quite low, and even at those sort of medium flows, there's a lot of decisions being made constantly about how high the Dee is and how quickly and slowly the level goes up. At Welsh Dee Trust, we've got concerns really about how some of those decisions are made and what the priorities are being made. Obviously, 2 million homes and having enough drinking water for those 2 million homes is important, as is flooding and making sure people's houses don't get flooded is important. But also, we really believe that wildlife and the special area of conservation, the wildlife and the recreational fisheries of the river are also important and need to be taken in as part of the decision process for these river levels, which we're not entirely convinced it has the priority it should do. So there's sort of 3 key problems really that we've identified. One is called spate clipping. So a spate is the natural high water from when it rains. Not so much a flood, but the high water that stays within the banks really. These spates are really important for changing the river and creating the niches of the river, and super important for fish migration, particularly fish coming up from the estuary up the river. They rely on these natural spates to bring them up, and it's this high water that they use to trigger their movement up the river. The need to store water in the reservoirs and make sure that there's enough water for later on in the year when there's low flows means that what's potentially happening, or what we think is happening, is that we're getting spate clipping. So really, those spates are not allowed to be as big as they would be if it was a completely natural river. On this graph, you can sort of see green is the flow of the river, and this is in sort of August. Yeah, this is in the summer of 2011, and the red is where our modelling sort of shown where we think the river would have been if it was natural. So you can see each of those green spates isn't as big as it would have been if naturally occurring, and you can also see absolutely complete spates that have just completely been taken away, and there's been no high water at all, when really there should have been a surge of high water coming down the river. We think there's solutions for solving this problem, and I'll get onto those in a bit. The other one is the River Treryn, which comes down from Llyn, so from Celyn Reservoir. The way the water is released is very unnatural. You get very high river levels during the day and very low river levels during the night, going from sort of 9 cubic meters of water down to 1 cubic water of the evening. And this is happening every day. It's really high. Every evening it's really low, and that's having quite a large impact on the wildlife. Makes it very difficult for the wildlife living within the river, we believe. And actually, in the absolute worst case scenarios, there's more water being released from Llyn down the River Treryn than is being released down the Dee, and so then you get a reverse flow, and the water comes down the Celyn, and then it's actually flowing upstream from the Bala into Llyn, and particularly during this sort of smolt salmon, young salmon migrating season, if that happens, you get quite high mortality due to predation, because the fish, the river's flowing uphill. So it's incredibly challenging and confusing situation for the fish, and you tend to get quite high levels of predation at that point. And then the actual ballast sluices, which is used to control all of these levels on the river, they're quite serious barriers to fish migration. And there's big questions about, species, particularly the eels. Can eels move up and through all of this process, and can smolts, young salmon, can they move downstream through it effectively? And we're concerned that they're not. So this month, actually, in the next couple of weeks, we have put together a report, sort of identifying in a bit more detail each of these 3 problems, and we've identified 10 solutions at Welsh Dee Trust that we think, if put into action, would have very little or no impact on abstraction or the amount of water for drinking, but could have a big impact on improving the whole process for fish. So keep an eye out for that report that'll be released, and we're hoping that'll be sort of the beginning of the process of kick-starting some action, really. So that's who we are at Welsh Dee Trust. That's the sort of 5 key programs that we tackle on. Each one, as I said, we think we can have a small impact on a small problem. Bring them all together is the hope, and by tackling each of these 5 programs, and we can really start to turn around the declines on the river. Each one might be having a small impact, but once they're all built up together, plus hopefully the work of the Welsh Government and other organisations, really we can start to see a big turnaround in the health of the river and those declining species that are found within the river. And so we'll just take this opportunity, as I always do at the end of every talk I give, just to say thank you to all of the people who support Welsh Dee Trust. We really, without our supporters, without our volunteers, without our trustees, without the people who donate to us monthly, none of this work would really happen. There's 5 members of staff at Welsh Dee Trust. It's the other people that make it all happen. Not to take away from the staff, they work very hard as well, but it really is all of our supporters that, so big thank you to them. And that brings me to the end. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll move on to questions if anyone's got any.